And so the question he raises is part of the distinction that he brings to the modern study of politics. The answer he gives is also particularly distinctive. It's an answer that ruthlessly discriminates between politics and everything else, that asserts the autonomy of the political and the manner in which all other human values can be reduced to the struggle for power and the provision or maintenance of order.
A copy of The Prince was finally presented to a Medici, who gave no indication he ever read it. It would never be published in Machiavelli's lifetime, and when he died, he went to hell. Sort of.
The demonization of Machiavelli began very shortly after Machiavelli's death, and that came at a time when the crisis of the contesting religions was really kicking into full gear in the 1530s and 40s. And both sides saw a demon in Machiavelli.
Poor Niccolò. Not only is he now a demon, but the Medici plague him even in hell. His ideas are said to have inspired the massacre of 50,000 French Protestants in 1572, while Catherine de' Medici was Queen of France. And Protestant England makes Niccolò its prime villain.
There is the idea that everything that is base and Italian and Southern and Catholic is somehow Machiavellian.
It is at that time, the time of Marlowe and Shakespeare, that this association with evilness becomes apparent. They talk about Iago as being Machiavellian. They talk about Richard III as being Machiavellian.
Then there's a kind of rehabilitation that takes place in the era of classical republicanism, including some of the classical republicanism of England, when people began to look at Machiavelli the Republican.
The state of Machiavelli's soul is a good deal less important to us than the nature of his legacy, the uses to which his ideas have been put.
In the 20th century has seen him on the one hand as a precursor of autocratic or even totalitarian views of government, and on the other as a good Republican and a fine social scientist who helps us to understand how things work.
Washington, Napoleon, Churchill, Lenin, intellectual children of the same father. How Machiavellian. Now, history can't tell us where Niccolò's soul ended up. But we do know that he believed in keeping up appearances, and that his mortal remains were put in the Cathedral of Santa Croce, among other honored Florentines. We also know that his influence is far from dead. Machiavelli and the Prince seem very much in vogue today. For instance, a columnist for U.S. News and World Report used them to critique a president. And that same president quoted them to the Washington Post to support his policies.
It must be considered that there is nothing more difficult to carry out, nor more doubtful of success, nor dangerous to handle, than to initiate a new order of things. For the reformer has enemies in all those who profit from the old order, and only lukewarm defenders in those who...
So Machiavelli freelances now as a White House advisor. There's more than metaphor here. If Machiavelli invented politics as we know them, politics as we know them have given us back some latter-day Machiavellis. Advisors, strategists, political realists, maybe not above a dirty trick or two, but only in the name of good, clean winning. And if Machiavelli seems to work for two very different systems, so can these guys. Niccolò is doing well today. While his former estate turns out a fine Chianti wine in his name, he has joined Attila the Hun in the ranks of big-name corporate advisors, and he has interests in a couple of games on the market, which more or less use his precepts. One of them gets the history a bit wrong, and it has a golden rule that might have come from the prince, if Machiavelli had thought of it. Maybe all this is Niccolò's purgatory. Judgment of his legacy is still in dispute, and even his staunchest defenders will admit he had some, well, flaws. He sometimes got the history wrong, too.
He raided history, I think, to produce the examples as he understood them, to make the points that he wanted, rather than seeking to first discover what really happened. He was let's put it this way, he was not a producer of history, he was a consumer.
I think that his assessment of human nature is one where anyone would agree that human nature is imperfect. But for Machiavelli, it's more than imperfect. It is never guided by a good motive. And that, I think, is, in fact, less realistic.
Like many realists, he thought that reality was self-evident. And in fact, reality is the hardest thing to assess.
Machiavelli lived when new ideas and technologies were changing forever the realities of power and the notions of government. So do we, and his advice to analyze carefully the requirements for success without losing the courage to act seems painfully relevant today.
The other thing that is left is that he leaves us is to understand that once you have to put that analysis in the service of some idea, which he did in the discourses, where he described his idea of republican government. And I think the Prince must be read in conjunction with the discourses, because there are two sides, what was to him the same coin, and that was an important insight.
There are certain books which are sufficiently complicated that they have a message for different people in different times, because somehow they've touched at an aspect of fundamental human experience. Plato's Republic is one example of that, Rousseau's Social Contract, or Locke. Machiavelli's Prince is a book like that. It deals with an aspect of human life in a very profound way. The central aspect being the role of leaders and why leaders are necessary in any complicated human community.
Gary Hart has written the book which he says Machiavelli might have written had he been an idealist. Hart sees important similarities between Niccolò's time and ours.
I believe that we are living on the hinge of history, on the cusp of history, and it happens no more frequently than every 100 years, sometimes every 500 years. And we are so in the middle of this, symbolically new century, new millennium, really new economic age, information versus industry or machines, and a new order in the world to replace the old Cold War order. And what is important is that this country find a new prince, find a patriot who can help us define what the next era is.
Some readers of The Prince smell brimstone in its pages. Others find it more like ammonia, repugnant but profoundly clarifying. In truth, much of what Machiavelli wrote merely described how things actually were done in his time.
The second sense in which I think Machiavelli is to be disagreed with is in the fundamental conclusion that he reached about the possibility of divorcing political matters from ethical considerations. I don't think it can be done, in fact. It's quite apart from whether it ought to be done.
Yet few with any experience today would deny that much of what he wrote seems merely the common sense of politics.
There's another sense in which we say Machiavelli is giving us the common sense of politics, and we ought to be more suspicious of this usage. There all we're saying is that what he says is common sense because we're already imitating him.
So, Mr. President, having described how things really work in this perilous world, let me close with a few additional words of caution. Choose the most brilliant advisors. Tell them to speak to you candidly, and then be wary of their advice. When decision time comes, keep your own counsel, and never ever forget that you are in show business, that leadership is 9/10 acting a role. Never step out of it in public. Don't, for God's sake, carry your own bags. Welcome to the top of the heap, and lots of luck. Your humble and admiring servant, Niccolò Machiavelli. P.S. Don't look to heaven for your reward.
Machiavelli's death. And that came at a time when the crisis of the contesting religions was really kicking into full gear in the 1530s and 40s. And both sides saw a demon in Machiavelli.
Economy of the political, and the manner in which all other human values can be reduced to the struggle for power and the provision or maintenance of order.
A copy of The Prince was finally presented.
And so the question he raises is part of the distinction that he brings to the modern study of politics. The answer he gives is also particularly distinctive. It's an answer that ruthlessly discriminates between politics and everything else, that asserts the autonomy.
Poor Niccolò. Not only is he now a demon, but the Medici plague him even in hell. His ideas are said to have inspired the massacre of 50,000 French Protestants in 1572, while Catherine to a Medici, who gave no indication he ever read it. It would never be published in Machiavelli's lifetime, and when he died, he went to hell. Sort of.
The demonization of Machiavelli began very shortly after Machiavelli.